The arena was absolutely silent as Commander Una Park helped Gorath, the Unbroken, rise to his feet. Two warriors stood together in the center of the blood-stained sand. One was massive and covered in scales that had turned aside weapons for centuries. The other was small and broken and barely able to remain standing. Yet somehow it was the small one who radiated strength. In that moment, Arbiter Vethkon rose from his observation platform with an expression that mixed fury and disbelief in equal measure. "This is not how challenges end," he declared. "One champion must yield or die, and those are the only outcomes permitted by our laws. Your champion has yielded," Una replied without releasing Goreth's hand. He acknowledged his defeat, and that satisfies the requirements of your ancient laws. Vethkon turned his black eyes toward Gorath with obvious expectation. The Kethver warrior met his gaze without flinching. "The human speaks truth," Gorath said, and his voice carried through the silent arena with perfect clarity. "I am defeated, and I yield to her, and any who wish to dispute this outcome may face me personally after my wounds have healed." The threat was unmistakable, and several representatives who had been preparing to object suddenly found other things to look at. Una released Gorath's hand and turned to face the assembled. Coalition blood continued to drip from her wounds, and her left arm hung uselessly at her side, and every breath sent knives of pain through her broken ribs. None of that mattered. "I have won the right of challenge," she announced. "By your own laws, humanity is now entitled to provisional membership in the Galactic Military Coalition." Vethkon's hands gripped the railing of his platform so hard that the metal began to bend. "The law is the law," he admitted through clenched teeth. "Humanity will receive provisional status, and you may make your one demand as the term specified." Una did not hesitate. "The Morath will be freed," she said. "All of them and every member of their species currently held by the Coalition will be released, and they will be provided with transport to a habitable world of their choosing where they can rebuild their civilization without interference." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Sandrani representative rose from her seat with 4 arms spread in a gesture of disbelief. "You would spend your single demand on a conquered species," she asked. "You could ask for technology, or territory, or 100 other things that would benefit your people, and instead, you choose this." "I choose justice," Una replied. "That is what my people believe in, and that is what we fight for." She turned slowly to address the entire arena, and her voice grew stronger despite her injuries. "You call yourselves warriors," she said. "You have conquered worlds and defeated countless enemies and built an empire that spans the galaxy. And in all of that time, you have forgotten what true warriors are supposed to be." The crowd listened in stunned silence as this battered, broken human dared to lecture them. "Warriors do not exist to destroy the weak," Una continued. "We exist to protect them, and true strength is not measured by how many enemies you can kill, but by how many innocents you are willing to die for." She pointed toward the holding cells where the Morath still waited. Those creatures were terrified and helpless, and instead of protecting them, you used them for entertainment. She said, "You took a sentient species and reduced them to animals because it was convenient and because no one was strong enough to stop you." Her eyes found Vethkon and held his gaze without fear. "Today someone was strong enough," she said. "Today. Humanity stood against your cruelty, and we won." The arena remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. Then a sound came from the stands that Una did not expect. Gorath, the Unbroken, was clapping. His massive scaled hands came together with a sound like thunder, and the gesture of approval was unmistakable. Other Kethver in the crowd joined him. Then members of other species began to add their voices to the growing wave of support. Not all of them Vethkon and his Mordrix. Delegation remained stone-faced, and the Sandrani watched with cold calculation. But enough of the crowd was responding that the message was clear. Humanity had made an impression that would not easily be forgotten. Una felt her legs begin to give way as exhaustion and blood loss finally overwhelmed her willpower. Strong hands caught her before she could fall. Dorothy had moved faster than she would have believed possible for someone so badly wounded. "You are a strange species," he said as he helped support her weight. "In all my years, I have never seen a warrior fight as you did today." "How did I fight?" Yuna asked through gritted teeth. Like someone who had already decided that victory was more important than survival, Gorith replied. Like someone who was willing to sacrifice everything for something beyond herself. He looked down at her with an expression she could not read. "I have faced thousands of opponents," he continued. "Warriors and soldiers and killers of every species in the galaxy, and not one of them ever defeated me and then offered me their hand." "What will you do now?" Yuna asked. Garth considered the question carefully. "I will return to my people, and I will tell them what I witnessed here," he said. "I will tell them that there is a species called humanity that fights like no one we have ever encountered. And I will tell them that these humans are not our enemies, but that they would make formidable allies." The arena was beginning to empty as the crowd-dispersed medical teams from multiple species were approaching to tend to the wounded champions. Taram appeared at Yuna's side with a data tablet showing the official coalition decree authorizing the release of all Morith prisoners. "It is done," he said. "The order has been transmitted to every facility holding Morith captives, and they will be free within the standard week." Yuna took the tablet and stared at the official seal that validated the decree. She thought about the creatures in the cage who had huddled together to protect their children. She thought about how close she had come to dying in that arena. She thought about what her team would have faced if she had failed. It had been worth it, every broken bone and torn muscle and drop of blood had been worth it, because today humanity had shown the galaxy something important. They had shown that there was a completely different warrior kind. A kind that measured strength, not in conquest but in compassion. A kind that protected the weak instead of preying upon them. A kind that offered mercy, even to fallen enemies. The Coalition would never forget this day. And the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. Lieutenant Dowan appeared at her side and offered a crisp salute. "The transport is ready, Commander," he reported. "We can take you to the medical bay now." Yuna nodded and allowed her team to help her toward the exit. Before they left the arena, she looked back one final time. Gorath was still standing where she had left him. He raised one massive hand in a gesture of farewell and respect. Yuna returned the gesture despite the pain it caused. Then she turned and walked away. Behind her, the empty arena seemed to echo with the memory of what had happened there. A different kind of warrior had emerged, and nothing would ever be the same. The arena was filled beyond capacity when Commander Yuna Park walked onto the sand-covered floor. Every species in the Coalition had sent representatives to witness what they believed would be a swift and brutal execution. The mood in the crowd was festive, as if they were attending a celebration rather than a death sentence. Garth the Unbroken was already waiting in the center of the arena. He had dressed for the occasion in ceremonial battle plate that covered his chest and shoulders, with interlocking scales of black metal. In his right hand he carried a weapon that looked like a cross between a mace and an axe, with a head large enough to crush a human body with a single blow. Yuna wore her standard combat uniform with no armor and no protection beyond the reinforced fabric of her jacket. In her hand, she carried a combat knife with a blade no longer than her forearm. The contrast between the two fighters drew laughter from some sections of the crowd and murmurs of disbelief from others. Arbiter Veth Khan stood on his observation platform and raised one massive hand to silence the spectators. "The right of challenge has been invoked," he announced. "Commander Yuna Park of Humanity faces Gorath the Unbroken of the Keth in single combat, and the duel will continue until one champion yields or dies, and no interference will be permitted." He paused and looked directly at Yuna with those bottomless black eyes. "Begin." He said Gorath did not waste time with posturing or threats. He charged forward with surprising speed for a creature of his size, and his weapon swept toward Yuna in a horizontal arc that would have cut her in half if it connected. Yuna was no longer standing where the weapon passed. She had dropped low and rolled to the side, and the blade passed over her head close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. Gorath spun and struck again, and again Yuna moved. This pattern continued for the first several minutes of the fight. Gorath attacked with devastating power, and Yuna evaded with movements that seemed almost casual in their efficiency. She did not try to block or parry his strikes because that would have been suicide. She simply was never where his weapon expected her to be. The crowd grew quiet as they watched. This was not what they had anticipated. The human was supposed to be crushed immediately, and instead she was dancing around their champion like a leaf in a storm. Gorath's frustration began to show in his attacks. His swings became wilder and more powerful as he tried to corner his elusive opponent. Finally, he caught her. The edge of his weapon caught Yuna across the ribs as she dodged a fraction of a second too slowly. The impact lifted her off her feet and sent her tumbling across the arena floor. Blood splattered on the sand, and the crowd roared with approval. Gorath stalked toward her fallen form with obvious satisfaction. "Stay down, little human," he growled. "Die with what dignity remains to you." Yuna pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. Blood dripped from her side, and her breathing was labored, and every movement sent waves of pain through her body. She stood up anyway. The arena fell silent again. Gorath tilted his massive head with something that might have been confusion. "You should not be able to stand," he said. "That blow would have killed any other species." Yuna wiped blood from her mouth and raised her knife again. "I am not any other species," she replied. Gorath attacked again, and this time he did not hold back. His weapon became a blur of motion as he struck at Yuna from every angle. She could not evade all of them. A blow to her shoulder nearly dislocated her arm. A strike to her leg opened a gash that ran from hip to knee. A glancing hit to her head sent her spinning and left blood streaming down her face. Each time she fell, and each time she got back up, the crowd had stopped cheering. They watched in horrified fascination as the tiny human absorbed punishment that would have killed warriors from any other species. And still she rose. Gorath was breathing heavily now. The sustained assault had begun to drain even his legendary endurance. His strikes came slower and with less precision as fatigue took its toll. Yuna noticed. She had been waiting for this moment through all the pain and blood and broken bones. Her body was a ruin, but her mind remained sharp and focused on the task at hand. When Gorath's next swing came, she did not simply evade. She stepped inside his guard while his weapon was still extended. Her knife found the gap between his chestplate and his shoulder armor. The blade slid through scales and muscle until it struck something vital. Gorath bellowed in pain and stumbled backward. It was the first wound anyone had ever inflicted on him in combat. Yuna pressed forward despite her injuries. She was a broken thing held together by willpower alone. But she moved with the certainty of someone who had already accepted death and had nothing left to fear. Her knife struck again and again. Each cut was precise and targeted at the vulnerable points in Gorath's armor that she had identified during her hours of research. The great warrior tried to bring his weapon to bear, but Yuna was too close and too fast. She was inside his guard, where his size and strength became liabilities instead of advantages. Gorath fell to his knees. His weapon dropped from fingers that no longer had the strength to hold it. Blood poured from a dozen wounds that covered his body. He looked up at the human female who stood before him with her knife raised for the killing blow. "Finish it," he rasped. "I am defeated." Yuna lowered her knife. She reached out with her free hand and offered it to her fallen opponent. The gesture was so unexpected that Gorath could only stare in confusion. "What is this?" he demanded. "This is mercy," Yuna said. "This is what warriors do when the battle is over. and the enemy is no longer a cheer or wissy threat. She kept her hand extended despite the agony that the simple movement caused. "Take it," she said. "Stand with me and show the coalition that there is more than one kind of strength." Gorath looked at her hand and then at her face, and something changed in his burning eyes. Slowly and with obvious difficulty, he reached up and grasped her hand. She helped him rise. The Coalition Council chamber was a vast circular space designed to intimidate any species that stood before the assembled representatives. Tiers of seating rose up from the central floor, where accused parties were required to stand while the council looked down upon them from positions of obvious authority. Commander Una Park stood in that central space with her team arranged behind her, and faced the judgment of 12 different species who had already decided she was guilty arbiter. Vethkan occupied the highest seat, and his expression had not changed since the arena, and he still looked at the humans as if they were vermin that had wandered into his domain. "You have disrupted official coalition proceedings," he announced, in a voice that echoed through the chamber. "You have accused this body of deception, and you have demonstrated contempt for the evaluation process that determines which species are worthy of membership." Una listened without interrupting as the arbiter continued his litany of accusations. "The penalty for such offenses is severe," Vethkan concluded. "Humanity will be classified as a hostile species and appropriate containment measures will be implemented." The words hung in the air with terrible weight, and Una understood exactly what containment measures meant in coalition terminology. It meant warships in orbit around Earth. It meant the end of human expansion beyond their home system. It meant a slow death for her species as resources dwindled and population grew beyond what one planet could sustain. She had one chance, and Tarim had shown her the path forward during the hours between the arena and this hearing. "I invoke the right of challenge," she declared, and her voice cut through the murmuring of the council like a blade. Silence fell instantly. Vethkan's black eyes narrowed, and for the first time since she had met him, Una saw something other than contempt in his expression. It might have been surprise, or perhaps a grudging acknowledgement that she was more dangerous than he had assumed. "You know our ancient laws," he observed. "I know that any species under evaluation may challenge the judgment through representative combat," Una replied. Law was written into the original coalition charter, and it has never been repealed. The Kethver representative who had mocked her in the arena rose from his seat with obvious interest. "The right of challenge has not been invoked in over 400 years, he said. "Most species do not survive long enough to learn of its existence." "Humanity learns quickly," Una said without looking away from Vethkan. The arbiter leaned forward, and his massive hands gripped the arms of his chair with enough force to crack the material. "You understand what this means," he said. "If you invoke the right of challenge, I am permitted to select a champion to face you in single combat. And if you lose, your species will not simply be contained, and you will be declared a threat to galactic stability, and we will be obligated to eliminate that threat permanently." Una felt her team tense behind her, but she did not waver. "And if I win?" she asked. "Then humanity receives provisional membership in the coalition," Vethkan admitted with obvious reluctance. "And you may make one demand that we are bound by ancient law to grant." "The Marath," Una said immediately. "The creatures in the arena and all others of their kind currently held by the coalition, and they go free." Gasps echoed through the chamber, and several representatives began speaking at once in their own languages. The idea that a primitive species would challenge the coalition not for power or territory, but for the freedom of another conquered people was apparently beyond comprehension. Vethkan silenced the chamber with a gesture. "You would risk the existence of your entire species for creatures you have never met," he demanded. "Creatures that are not even acknowledged as sentient by official records." "I would risk everything for a principle," Una replied. "That is what warriors do." The Arbiter studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression that Yuna could not quite identify. "Very well," he said finally. "The right of challenge is granted, and I select as my champion Gorath, the Unbroken of the Kethver." The reptilian representative made a sound that might have been a laugh and rose from his seat to descend toward the arena floor. "I have waited centuries for worthy prey," Gorath announced as he walked. "The human female is small and weak, but perhaps she will provide a few moments of entertainment before I crush her." Yuna watched him approach and calculated her odds with cold precision. Gorath stood over 7 feet tall and weighed at least 4 times as much as she did. His scales were natural armor that had turned aside energy weapons and blade strikes, alike according to the combat records Tarim had. Provided he had fought in over 300 documented duels and had never lost a single one, by any rational measure she was going to die. She accepted this possibility with the same calm focus she had brought to every impossible situation in her career. "The duel will take place in one standard rotation," Vethkon declared. "Both champions will report to the primary arena at the designated time, and the combat will continue until one participant yields or dies. I do not accept yields," Gorath said with obvious pleasure. Yuna met his burning eyes without flinching. "Neither do I," she said. The hours before the duel passed in a blur of preparation and quiet contemplation. Lieutenant Dohwan tried to convince her to let him take her place, but Yuna refused without explanation. Sergeant Jisoo offered tactical analysis of Kethver combat techniques that might provide some advantage. Corporal Minho researched every recorded fight Gorath had ever participated in, looking for patterns or weaknesses. Private Sujin prepared medical supplies while trying not to think about how inadequate they would be against the injuries Yuna was likely to sustain. Tarim came to their quarters one final time with additional information he had managed to extract from classified databases. "Gorath favors overwhelming force," he explained. "He relies on his natural advantages of size and strength and armor, and he has never faced an opponent who could match those advantages." "Then I will not try to match them," Yuna said. "How will you fight him?" Tarim asked. Yuna smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I am going to let him hurt me," she said. "I am going to take everything he throws at me, and I'm going to keep getting up. And eventually, he will understand what human warriors have always known." "What is that?" "That pain is not the same as defeat," Yuna replied. "That endurance is a weapon too, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is not the one who hits hardest, but the one who simply refuses to fall." Tarim looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You truly believe you can win?" he said. Yuna shook her head slowly. "I believe that I might die," she admitted. "But I also believe that if I do die, I will die standing, and that is all any warrior can ask for." She turned to face her team one final time. "If I fall, you will return to Earth, and you will tell them what happened here," she ordered. "You will tell them that humanity was judged by monsters who call themselves civilized, and you will tell them that we refuse to become monsters ourselves, even when it cost us everything." Dohwan stepped forward and saluted with perfect precision. "You will not fall, Commander," he said, "because we will not allow it." Yuna returned the salute and felt a warmth spread through her chest despite the cold certainty of what was coming. These were her people. This was why she fought, and tomorrow she would show the entire galaxy what that meant. A completely different warrior kind. Part 2. The silence in the arena lasted for exactly 3 heartbeats before it shattered into chaos. Voices erupted from every direction as thousands of alien spectators reacted to what they had just witnessed. The human delegation had refused to fight, and in a place that existed solely to celebrate combat, this was an offense beyond comprehension. Arbiter Vethkon leaned forward on his platform, and his black eyes seemed to grow even darker with barely contained fury. "You dare to defy the evaluation," he demanded, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade through flesh. "You stand before the assembled warrior races of the galaxy, and you refuse to demonstrate your capabilities." Commander Unipark stood her ground with her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that conveyed both discipline and defiance. "I refuse to slaughter helpless creatures for your entertainment," she replied, and her voice remained steady despite the hostile gazes of thousands of aliens. "What you have asked us to do is not combat, and it is not warfare. It is certainly not a measure of our worth as warriors." A massive reptilian figure rose from the front row of the spectator seating, and Una recognized the species from her briefings as a Kethvor, was covered in scales that ranged from deep green to almost black, and two curved horns protruded from his skull above eyes that burned with an inner fire. "The human speaks of worth," he bellowed with a laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "What would a species that cannot even kill a caged animal know about worth?" Laughter rippled through sections of the crowd, and Una felt her team shifting uncomfortably behind her from another section. Of the arena came a voice belonging to a tall, slender being with skin the color of polished copper and 4 arms that gestured expressively as she spoke. "Perhaps the humans are simply cowards," the Sindrani delegate suggested with obvious disdain. "Perhaps they lack the stomach for real violence, and their claims of military prowess are nothing but empty boasting." Una turned to face the Sindrani directly. "I have killed in defense of my people and my planet," she said without emotion. "Every soldier standing behind me has taken lives in service of humanity, and we do not lack the ability or the will to fight, and we lack only the cruelty to murder the defenseless." She pointed toward the cage where the creatures still huddled together in obvious terror. "Look at them," she demanded. "They are not attacking, and they are not threatening anyone. And they are protecting their young because they know death is coming, and that is not the behavior of mindless beasts, and it is the behavior of thinking, feeling beings." Vethkan rose to his full imposing height, and his expression had shifted from anger to something colder and more dangerous. "You presume to lecture us on the nature of these specimens," he said. "They are classified as hostile fauna from a quarantine world, and their purpose here is to test the combat readiness of aspiring coalition members." "Then your classification is wrong," Una replied, "or it is a deliberate lie." The accusation hung in the air like poison, and even the most hostile spectators fell silent at the implications. In the shadows of the upper tiers, a figure watched the confrontation with growing interest. Aram was young by coalition standards, having served only 40 years in the administrative division of the Arbiter's office. He was a Velfari, and his species was known for their analytical minds and their tendency to ask questions that others preferred to leave unanswered. He had accessed the files on the arena specimens 3 days ago, out of simple curiosity, and what he had found had disturbed him deeply. The creatures in the cage were called the Morth, and they were not animals at all. They were a sentient species whose homeworld had been conquered by the Coalition over 60 years ago. Their crime had been refusing to join the Coalition as a servant race, and their punishment had been the systematic destruction of their civilization. The survivors had been scattered across the galaxy and used for various purposes, including entertainment in arenas like this one. Had kept this information to himself because revealing it would mean the end of his career and possibly his life. But watching the human commander stand alone against the fury of the entire coalition, something shifted inside him. He made his way down through the crowds until he reached a service corridor that led to the arena floor. The Narration security systems recognized his administrative clearance and allowed him to pass without challenge. He found the humans in a holding area adjacent to the arena where they had been taken after Vethkan had ordered them removed from the main floor. Commander Park looked up as he entered, and he saw no fear in her eyes despite the situation she was facing. I'm Taram," he said quietly while checking to make sure no one had followed him. I work in the Arbiter's office, and I have information you need. He transferred a data file to the terminal in the room and watched as the human commander's expression changed from suspicion to understanding, and finally to something that looked like vindication. "They are sentient," she said, and it was not a question. The Morath were a spacefaring civilization before the Coalition deemed them unworthy of independence. Turam confirmed there are no official records of their true nature, because such records were purged decades ago. But I found fragments in archived communications that were never properly deleted. Lieutenant Dohan stepped forward with his hand resting on his sidearm. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked. "What do you gain from helping us?" Taram considered the question carefully before answering. "I have spent my entire career believing that the Coalition represented the highest ideals of galactic civilization," he said. "Today I watched your commander refuse to participate in murder, and I watched my superiors condemn her for it, and I realized that perhaps the Coalition has lost sight of what those ideals were supposed to mean." Commander. Park studied the data file in silence for a long moment before looking up at Taram with an expression he could not quite read. "This was never an evaluation of our combat abilities," she said. "Was it?" Taram shook his head slowly. "The Coalition already knows that humanity has significant military capabilities," he admitted. "Your species has been under observation for over a century, and this evaluation was designed to test something else entirely." "What?" Sujin asked from the back of the room. Taram met Commander Park's eyes as he answered. "Your willingness to be cruel," he said. "The Coalition values strength, but it values obedience more, and a species that will kill on command without question is a useful tool, and a species that asks why is a threat. Then we just failed their test." Jisoo observed grimly. Commander Park straightened her shoulders, and when she spoke, her voice carried a resolve that made Taram understand why this woman had been chosen to represent her species. "No," she said. "We passed a different test, and now we need to make sure the Coalition understands exactly what kind of warriors humanity truly is." The station called Karath Prime hung in the darkness of space like a massive metal flower with petals made of docking bays and observation decks that stretched outward in every direction. Commander Yuna Park stood at the viewport of the human transport vessel and watched as their ship slowly approached the station that would determine the future of her entire species. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death more than once and had learned not to fear it. Behind her stood 4 other soldiers who made up the entirety of humanity's military delegation to the Galactic Military Coalition. There was Lieutenant Dewan Kim, who served as her second-in-command, and whose calm demeanor hid a mind that could calculate battlefield tactics faster than most computers. Sergeant Jisoo Beek was their weapons specialist, and she had already memorized the technical specifications of every known alien armament in the Coalition database. Corporal Minho Chai handled communications and cultural protocols, and he had spent the last 6 months learning 12 different alien languages. Private Sujin Han was the youngest of the group at only 23 years old, but her skills as a field medic had already saved dozens of lives during the border conflicts back on Earth. Together, they represented the best that humanity had to offer, and Yuna felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The transport shuddered slightly as it passed through the atmospheric barrier of the main docking bay, and artificial gravity took hold of the vessel. Yuna straightened her uniform one final time and turned to face her team. "Remember why we are here," she said in a voice that carried easily, despite its softness. "The Coalition has existed for over 3,000 years, and they have seen hundreds of species come and go, and they will judge us not just on our combat abilities, but on everything we do and say from this moment forward." Dohan nodded and checked his sidearm one last time before holstering it. "We are ready, Commander," he said simply. The airlock opened with a hiss of pressurized gas, and Yuna led her team out onto the docking platform, where a reception committee was already waiting for them. The first thing she noticed was the sheer variety of alien forms standing before her. There were tall insectoid creatures with compound eyes that reflected the overhead lights in 1,000 different colors. Beside them stood massive reptilian beings covered in scales that looked harder than steel armor. Smaller furry creatures with multiple arms chittered quietly to each other while watching the humans with obvious curiosity. At the front of the group stood a figure that commanded immediate attention through presence alone. He was humanoid in shape, but stood nearly 8 feet tall with blue-gray skin that had the texture of worn leather. His eyes were solid black orbs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And when he spoke, his voice resonated through the docking bay like distant thunder. "I am Arbiter Vethkon of the Mordrix," he announced without any greeting or welcome. "You are the representatives of the species called humanity, and you have come to be evaluated for potential membership in the Galactic Military Coalition." Yuna stepped forward and offered a slight bow of respect. "I am Commander Yuna Park, and I speak for Earth and all her people in this matter." Vethkon studied her with those bottomless black eyes, and she felt as if he was looking straight through her flesh and bone to examine her very soul. "Your species is young," he said, and the word young carried a weight of dismissal that was impossible to miss. "You have been traveling among the stars for less than 200 years, and you have fought no wars beyond your own solar system, and you have conquered no worlds and enslaved no peoples." "That is correct," Yuna replied evenly. "We do not believe that conquest and enslavement are necessary measures of a species' worth." A ripple of reaction passed through the assembled aliens, and Yuna heard what might have been laughter from some of the larger reptilian creatures. Vethkon raised one massive hand and silence fell immediately. "The Coalition does not care what you believe," he said. "We care only about what you can do, and tomorrow you will demonstrate your combat capabilities in the arena, and we will see if humanity deserves a place among the warrior races of the galaxy." The reception after that announcement was brief and perfunctory. The humans were assigned quarters in a section of the station that was clearly designed for smaller species, and Yuna had to duck her head to pass through some of the doorways once they were alone, and Minho had swept the room for surveillance devices. They gathered around the small table in the center of the main chamber. "That went well," Jisoo said with dry humor that did nothing to hide the tension in her voice. "They do not respect us," Dohwan observed. "Every species in that docking bay looked at us like we were insects that had wandered into their home." "Can you blame them?" Minho asked as he pulled up holographic files on his portable terminal. "I have been researching the combat histories of the Coalition member species, and the numbers are terrifying, and the Mordrix alone have conquered over 40 worlds, and the Kethver have fought in more than 1,000 documented wars." Sujin, who had been quiet until now, spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "What kind of combat trial do you think they have planned for?" "Yous asked Commander." Yuna considered the question carefully before answering. "Standard evaluations for new species typically involve simulated battles against holographic opponents," she said. But Vethkon seemed to be implying something more direct. "And I think we should prepare for the possibility that this will be a live combat scenario. The night passed slowly, and Yuna found herself unable to sleep as she reviewed everything she knew about the Coalition and its members. When morning came, and the humans were escorted to the arena, she understood immediately that her worst suspicions had been correct. The arena was a massive circular space with seating for thousands of spectators, arranged in ascending tiers that disappeared into the darkness high above. In the center of the arena floor was a large cage made of energy barriers that glowed with a faint blue light. Inside the cage were creatures unlike anything Yuna had ever seen. They had multiple limbs and bodies covered in thick, dark fur, and their faces were dominated by large eyes that held an unmistakable gleam of intelligence. Vethkan stood on a raised platform, overlooking the arena, and his voice boomed through speakers that surrounded the space. "Humanity will now demonstrate its warrior capabilities," he announced. "You will enter the cage and eliminate the hostile specimens, and the coalition will observe and judge your performance." Yuna looked at the creatures in the cage, and something about their behavior made her pause. They were not attacking the barriers or roaring with aggression. They were huddled together in the center of the cage, and the larger ones had positioned themselves protectively around smaller forms that could only be there. Young, these creatures were not monsters waiting to kill. They were a family waiting to die. Yuna turned to face her team and saw that they had noticed the same thing. She made her decision in that moment, and it would change everything. "Stand down." She ordered in a voice loud enough for the entire arena to hear. "Lower your weapons, and we will not be doing this." The silence that followed was absolute.